Hello, romantics. I'm Sarah Gomez, author, romance lover, and host. You're listening to Romancing the Story, a podcast centered around writing, reading, and story structure, all with a twist of romance. We're at episode 25, and on today's episode, it's a spicy book blurb summer. I speak with Jessie Cunniffe on the latest and greatest of book blurbs, answering questions writers submitted, and why it's important authors put their best writing foot forward when creating a blurb. Throughout the interview, Jessie mentioned the spicy book blurb playbook and the book blurb magic courses she offers, along with a discount code for the podcast, so be sure to use that at checkout. Jessie is a total rock star and included a couple of freebies for listeners if the book blurb talk has you feeling some kind of way, or if you're curious to know more about bettering your blurbs. All the links are included with the show notes. There's a point in our chat where I throw out some information about half of self-published books on Amazon being in the romance genre. And I actually did a little digging and found the sources to corroborate my story. I included them in the show notes too, if you're curious. I always forget to mention it. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe, review, or share. It helps grow the show and gets it out there so I can bring more awesome guests and great interviews. And I just really appreciate it. So you have my eternal thanks as well. With that said, let's dive right in. Welcome, professional book blurb coach and creator of Book Blurb Magic, Jessie Cunniffe. Yay!
Hi, Sarah. It's so good to be
here. Wonderful. I'm so excited to have you on, Jessie. We've been waiting for this for months.
we have, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Oh, yes. And I actually learned about you through Instagram. Like, I saw all your reels. Okay. I found all your videos and everything like that about book blurbs, what you should, what you shouldn't do. For anyone who's maybe has not met you yet or seen any of your reels or great TikToks, can you tell people a little bit about yourself and how you became a professional book blurb writer?
Yeah, part of the fun of this kind of niche is that people are like, so how did you end up here? And then I'm like, yeah, it's actually a weird journey. So essentially I'm a teacher by trade. I'm actually a music teacher and I've done that for too long. But I've always done writing in like a freelance capacity. So I've done editing. I'm always that friend that everyone was like, hey, can you write my cover letter for me? Because I don't know what I'm doing. And in particular, I wrote music reviews for about 10 years for one of our papers here in Australia. And I had to work with really tight word limits. So I'm kind of obsessed with short form writing. One of my most memorable jobs was that I had to write album reviews that were only 75 words long. So I just like trying to squish the most amount of information in the least amount of words, which I know a lot of people find completely mental. And I acknowledge it's weird. But essentially what happened in 2020 was that I had a little less teaching work than usual. And I had this one day a week free. And I was like, I would like to do some more writing for money in a more structured way. Like, I've done this on the side for years. Let's do it some more. And it's kind of funny because I wrote a book about teaching piano. That's my instrument. And it was like, it's not the best book in the world. I'm just going to trash myself right here. It was my first experiment with self-publishing. And I had the whole experience of going through KDP and writing my own blurb. And I just kind of thought, hey, this is fun. And when I was thinking about what I could write for other people, I was like, I'll just do something short, something easy. I'll just do book blurbs. And in my mind, that was a really easy thing to do. My only concern was, I was like, do I have to read all these books? So I sat down and thought about it. And I was like, I don't think I need to, because I'm not the target audience for everyone's book. So I shouldn't really need to read it, because what if I have a different experience to their target readership, and then I completely misrepresent their book? So I put together a series of questions, which I actually still use today, for authors to answer. And then I would work off that and ask them extra questions if I had to. And I was like, hey, you can have unlimited revisions. We'll go back and forth if we need to. And I put up a gig on Fiverr. So I started writing. I remember my first blurb was like for some political book. And then my second one was about like getting jobs once you're over 60, like just totally random and think, you know, genres that I had no experience with. And my customers were really happy. And then Fiverr decided to promote me. So I got like bumped to the top of the listings and they were like, you know, you're obviously a really high quality seller. And then it just exploded. And that was partly due to the pandemic because lots of people had more time to write, like myself, and lots of new books were getting published, and self-publishing is obviously, you know, booming. But also I just had all of these authors saying to me, my God, I hate writing the blurb so much. And, you know, hit the nail on the head. Thank you for making it so easy. And I was like, I didn't think it was this hard. Like, what? I didn't realize this was something everyone hated. So I was completely naive. As I said, I only just dipped my toe in the water of self-publishing. And then I was kind of like, oh, okay, I want to help as many people as possible. But I was working my day job 4 days a week, and then 1 day a week wasn't enough to do all the blurbs. So I was coming home from my day job and working till 11 p.m. churning out all these blurbs. By the end of 2020, I was like, I can't do this anymore. It's not sustainable. Mm-hmm. I wonder if I can teach people to do it. So being a teacher, I was like, I'm going to create a course. So I created Book Blurb Magic, which is like my original flagship course for fiction and nonfiction blurbs. They're both encapsulated in the one course. And I started selling that at the end of 2020. And the romance community is actually very dear to my heart because it was you guys that actually exploded Book Blurb Magic first. I had Nikki Castle, if you've heard of her, she's written 5 Rounds and 2 Fights. Awesome author. She actually found me on Instagram, I think when I had like 50 followers, and she bought my course and she posted about me. And I was like, I don't know if I would have bought my course from me when I had like, there was this little account with 50 followers. But yeah, she posted about me, and then it kind of snowballed from there in terms of growing my Instagram following, which was really, really cool. And then I started realizing just how many romance authors there are, because weirdly enough on Fiverr, I did work with romance authors, but they were like a normal proportion of my work. Like it sort of went across loads and loads of genres. Whereas now, I just like a huge portion of my audience in Book Blurb Magic is our romance authors. It's been really cool getting to know more about that. Well, I say that genre. There's so many subgenres. It's so complicated. I have learned so many acronyms and initialisms for all different like tropes and things. It's just been fascinating, particularly over the last year. And I have so much respect for just the cool stories that they're coming up with, and also the way that they're actually driving blurb trends, which we will talk about a little bit later, because I think that's a super cool thing. So that's how I've ended up here. And now I do this more than I do teaching.
Well, I love that you took like 2 big strengths of yours, teaching and, you know, short form, like writing, and then kind of married the 2 and found like the perfect pain point that all authors seem to share.
Yeah. And it was completely by accident. I was like, I actually didn't think people would buy blurbs from me. I was like, oh, you know, it's only 150 words. Who's going to pay me to do that? And I was completely wrong, happily.
Yeah. Yeah, I can tell you right now, this is my most requested episode I've had. Wow. Like when I told several like listeners and a couple of friends that, hey, I'm going to have this person on my podcast. I'm going to have Jessie on there from Book Blurb Magic. And they were like, she writes book blurbs. I'm like, yes. And they were like, that's all. That's perfect. That's what we need.
I think it's such a misunderstood part of the self-publishing process, and it's definitely something that authors beat themselves up about, because I see so many authors kind of go, well, I wrote a book, I should be able to write a blurb, and I'm kind of like, no, they're 2 completely different skills. I do, however, think that authors are uniquely placed to write excellent blurbs because they know their book so well. And 9 times out of 10, when I'm, you know, chatting to an author about their book, if I'm writing their blurb for them, it's things that they say that end up in the blurb, that end up as the hook or end up as that first sentence. So there's so much advantage to being the author and writing your own blurb, as well as saving money. Like, you know, it's expensive to pay someone to write it for you. But other times, you know, people sort of go, have a look through Book Blurb Magic, have a look through sort of my freebie, and then go, you know what, actually, what I've learned from this is I would like someone else to do it for me. And that's also totally okay. And that's why I offer both.
Yeah. And that's kind of part of the battle, right? Is finding out which one works best for you, for each author individually.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
And I'm kind of in the same boat, but I'm come from a marketing background. So when I look at blurbs, I'm looking at from a marketing lens, because to me, that's very much like, I know you're trying to put as much information into this very short form as possible. And you're trying to, like you said, create that hook. You're trying to use kind of some of those buzzwords, or at least some of the keywords, right? That you can kind of get those readers. So I know a lot of authors, great writers, aren't so good marketers, or they don't know a lot about marketing. So it's really hard sometimes to write that blurb.
Yes. Although this is a funny paradox. I tend to tell authors not to stress too much about marketing when writing the blurb, because the most important thing about the blurb is actually that it accurately represents your book. And as an author, you're perfectly placed to do that, because you'll know if there's something that's wrong in the blurb, like that doesn't sound like your character. And authors are really, really good at this. Like if I write a blurb for someone and they come back and they go, oh, actually, I think that word isn't right to describe my character. Like they're spot on, right? They know their character and their story. So I think 9 times out of 10, when I've been disappointed with a book, it's because I've read the blurb, loved it, and then the book has not been what the blurb has said. Even sometimes it just comes down to like the vibe, the atmosphere, the type of language that you get from the blurb. And to me, that's a lot more important. Yes, there are things like keywords, and obviously there's an art to getting a catchy hook. But I don't like to approach it from a marketing lens. I like to critique it with a marketing lens afterwards. But I think the creative process and the accuracy is so much more important first. And also, like, once you know what should be in a blurb in terms of how much information, that also, I think, captures the marketing element, because you're not rambling for ages. It's to the point and it's selling your book, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because I think we've all had that shared experience of reading a blurb and then the book just didn't live up to it in some way, because something, it, like you said, didn't capture the atmosphere, wasn't really accurate, or, something to that degree to where I didn't feel like I read, maybe we didn't feel like we read the same book.
Exactly. And that was like, interestingly, that's a big complaint that I had from clients coming to me. They're like, I've been through 3 blurb writers, or, I paid $400 for this blurb writer and it was completely wrong. And it's like, they read my book, but they didn't read my book. Do you know what I mean? Like, and that's part of, I get authors sometimes sort of coming to me for my one-to-one service and they go, well, why aren't you reading my whole book? And I'm like, I will look through your manuscript to get a feel for your tone, but it's much more important that you tell me what your book is so I can sell that, because you know what your book is. And if I read it, I may not have the same experience as your target readership. So
it's true.
Yeah. And that's why accuracy is kind of like the thing that I like authors to focus on the most. If it accurately represents it, then readers are going to get the experience that they signed up for, and you're more likely to get better reviews. If you get terrible reviews because your blurb didn't match your book, it doesn't mean that your book is bad. It means that readers didn't get what they were hoping for.
And is that pretty much the most common mistake you see writers make, is that it doesn't quite match up? The blurb doesn't match up to the book? Or is it
not there's a lot of mistakes. But no, actually that's a strength that authors have. When authors write their own blurbs, they are accurate. However, I would say the biggest mistake I see is that the wrong information is included. So like it ends up being vague. So like the point that, for instance, raises the stakes might be missing, or a crucial bit of information about how a character got to a place. Or sometimes it's as simple as I was critiquing a blurb the other day and the hook was fantastic, but it mentioned this one thing that was then not mentioned anywhere else in the blurb. And you were kind of left wondering, like, so where did that come into it? So just small things like that are really easy to miss if you're like in your book and you kind of, your brain fills in the gaps, right? When you're looking at your blurb, that would probably be the biggest mistake I see, is a little bit of vagueness. But in terms of character descriptions and capturing like I always come back to the vibe of the book, right?
Yes.
Authors are great at doing that. That's easier for them to do than for me coming in as an outsider.
Yeah. And you know what? I would agree with that. A lot of times I can understand the characters. Like I understand going into it who the characters usually are, or at least the players, right? The players in the game.
Mm,
But sometimes I
mm.
don't understand exactly what the plot is or what kind of is going
Yeah,
on in the,
yeah,
in the book itself.
yeah. So in Book Blurb Magic, I actually have an example of a blurb used with permission that somebody sent to me, and they were like, I wrote this, can you critique it? And I was like, I literally can't tell from your blurb what genre you are. Like
Oh.
zero. It could be a high fantasy book, or it could be okay, I got that it was fiction, but
Mhm.
like literally no idea whether this was, straight fiction, fantasy, thriller, like nothing. Because there were like cool character descriptions, and then really like mysterious kind of, what will happen if, they can't face up to their fears. And I'm like, but their fears about what? um, which actually sort of brings me around to my golden rule for blurb writing. And I do throw around the term golden rule a bit, but this is honestly my one. If I use it later on, know that this is my one golden rule, which to remember, which is the reader doesn't care about your characters yet. They will when they read the
Ah.
book, but you can't make them care about your characters enough to care about their inner monologue in 150 words. It's just not going to happen, which is interestingly counterintuitive for a genre like romance. But if you
Right.
sort of consider when people like, if I read a blurb and it's a character that I have never met before, and they're like, am I strong enough to love again? I'm going to be like, I don't really care. I know that sounds so harsh, but I'm like, why would I care if you can love again? Whereas if you give me something more concrete, like, why was Dan's head so close to that brunette at the dinner table? Then I'm like, well, I don't know. Why? What happened? Was there
Mhm.
something more, or are you delusional? Or so it's actually about focusing on the concrete more than that inner monologue. And that definitely trips a lot of authors up, because you wrote a whole book about your characters. You love them. You know them inside out, and you want to share their nuances.
Yes.
But the nuances have to come later. We can't care about
Mm.
about them. So readers care about what happens to your characters in the blurb, not what they're feeling. That's kind of the bottom line.
I think that's really hard for especially romance writers. I know for me as a romance writer, because I love my characters, but you're
Yeah.
right, readers don't quite know them yet. So they're just like,
Yeah.
eh.
And I
Like,
think that's something that is really, that people often find really cringe about
yes.
romance blurbs as well, because they're just like, oh, it's so dramatic. And while there's always going to be people who love
Yeah.
that and who are like, oh, I want to find out about that character, by and large, a lot of people are going to be like, I don't really care yet. They're not going to think that. They're just going to walk away and find another book. But it's not going to capture them in the same way.
Right. And you mentioned like by reading a blurb, you should be able to tell what genre it is. So
Yeah.
do you find that romance is more the dramatic genre? Is that kind of where we're going?
It can be. I actually think all authors have a tendency to make their blurb a little more dramatic than it needs to be. I think it comes from this place of really needing to sell, like, oh, I need to make it sound like bigger than Ben-Hur. And I get that anxiety so totally. I get it. So if you take one thing away from today, it's that your book is enough. And if you accurately represent it, the readers who will love that will come. There is no need to kind of be like, especially towards the end of the blurb, like they'll put in
Mhm.
these really dramatic questions. I'm not saying you can never be dramatic, but it's just not always appropriate. Not all books are dramatic, and that's okay. We don't need to be like, the movie voiceover kind of drama in our blurbs. It's again, if your book doesn't fit that vibe, why would you be trying to attract readers who are attracted to that?
Well, and actually, that was one of the questions I asked to my author friends. I asked, "Do you have any questions specifically about blurbs?" And
Oh,
someone
awesome.
did. Someone did ask, "Should I start with a question?"
That is a great question. I'm a big fan of it. Actually, okay, let's talk about point of view, because that's going to
Yes.
tie into I'm
Okay.
about to say. I will say, if your listeners go to spicyblurbplaybook.com, they can grab my free mini course, which analyzes a first-person point of view spicy blurb in depth, so you can actually kind of see all the parts at play and get a feel for what's involved in writing a blurb like that, and decide whether you would like, me to write it for you or you want to have a go yourself. So there's been this huge explosion in first-person point of view blurbs in romance specifically. It's not super recent, but it is a notable difference from most other genres. Third-person blurbs have kind of been the industry standard for the longest time. It's kind of what publishing houses default to. My guess is that it's just because it's more formal, it's a little bit more detached, and there's also a whole lot of problems that come with first-person point of view blurbs, which is why questions can be so good. So a first-person point of view blurb, they can be done really well, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be teaching people how to do them. And there's definitely a sort of process in terms of whether you choose to do a first-person point of view blurb or not. If your particular subgenre of romance, you know that your readers are looking for first-person reads, you know that lots of other books like yours have first-person blurbs, then go for it. It's difficult to find any, hard research on this, but I've done some stalking of like reader blogs and all that kind of thing. And the sort of chatter out there is generally that there are a bunch of readers who are going to pass by your book if the blurb is not in the point of view they want to read in. And that's a reasonably new phenomenon, because most people would assume third person blurbs work for every single book. If in doubt, you can write in third person. There is nothing that says if your blurb is in third person, your book has to be in third person.
Okay.
But it doesn't work in the reverse. So you would never write a first person blurb for a third person book. If you write a first person blurb, people will expect a first person book, and they're going to be peeved.
Yes,
if they don't get it.
Yes, that was exactly why I gave you, that was one of my questions I had given you kind of prior to that, was kind of because that was exactly what happened. I'm usually pretty picky about first person POV. And so I had read a blurb in first person POV, and I was like, all right, I'll take a chance. And then I started reading it, and it was third person, and it took me out. I was like, what is happening? This is not what I ordered.
Exactly. But you wouldn't assume the same thing of a third person blurb, because there's just so many of them.
Yes.
And so what you do then is flick through the book, right? You'd flick open and go, oh, it's in first person or whatever. But first person blurb, it had better be a first person book. That's the next rule. But the issue with first person blurbs is that they can sound an awful lot like a stranger coming up to you and being like, hi, this is my life. I'm obsessed with so-and-so, but he's not obsessed with me, and blah, 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 blah. And you're like, I never asked. Like, thanks for just coming up and telling me all about your life. So questions work in pretty much any style of blurb, but they are especially useful for first-person romance blurbs, because they're an instant way to get the reader into a kind of conversation with your blurb. So the difference between, what you see in a lot of bad first-person blurbs is a lot of eyes at the beginning of every paragraph. And we don't like having conversations with those people. Nobody wants to have a conversation with someone who's like, oh, I did this and I did this, and then the other day I did this. That's not interesting. If you can ask your reader a question from the off, and this can be really great, especially for like spicy thrillers as well. I'm just trying to think of one I wrote recently. It wasn't quite a question, I guess, but it was. There was one that was like, have you ever been in a stalemate with the head of a mob? Like that's, and then it sort of moved on to be like, neither had I until blah happened, right? And then notice how that's instantly more conversational, right? It's like, and the reader is instantly going, oh no, I haven't, but whoa, what a situation to be in. I mean, if they say yes, then I'm a little concerned, but it's instant involvement in a way that you're not going to get if it's like, I thought my heart had been broken for the last time, but then so-and-so walked in. You're kind of like, it's kind of cool, but it's not involving me as much.
Right. No, that immediately grabs my attention as like the stalemate with the head of the mafia. Oh, excuse me, what? Yeah. What kind of life are you leading?
Exactly. And notice that actually does tell us heaps about the character without making it about the character. So it's not illegal, in quotes, to use I at the beginning of a paragraph ever. I definitely use it. But you don't want every paragraph to start with I,
Mm-hmm.
and you want to try and involve the reader as much as possible in your blurb. A really good first person blurb that I saw was not romance. This kind of like blew me out of the water, but Dervla McTiernan, who is a Irish Australian crime writer, her new book, The Murder Rule, has a first person blurb. Part of her book is in third person, so it did throw me. I had the same issue as you had with your book. I was like, oh, should you have done that? But it was just such a cool blurb, and the way that it was framed was the person talking the blurb said, they think I'm this, they think I'm this, they think I'm this, but I'm actually this. And I was like, whoa. And so it was such a clever way of making it about the character, because you're like, but without making it I, because instantly you're going, oh, would I think you're like that? Would I think, like, what would my judgment on your character be? You're kind of lumping you in with the they, makes the reader think that little bit more. So that's probably the main problem that authors run into with the first person blurb. The next is telling a narrative clearly, because it's also really weird if a character is like, I thought, my days in the such and such town where I grew up was blah, 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 blah. Nobody has a conversation like that. If you need to put that much detail in explicitly, write a third person blurb. It's going to be less weird. And then at the bottom, you can say this is a first POV book if you want to give that heads up to readers.
Oh, okay.
But you need to sort of be thinking about, how would your character speak? How would they actually have a realistic conversation? And how could you get that information in there without giving us a laundry list of your life, basically? And I mean, it's funny, I had someone on, I think it was TikTok or Instagram, commented and said, oh my God, I could never let my character on the back cover of my book. Like, I need to write it in third person because she's mental. Like, she won't be able to tell this story properly. And if that's the case, totally fine. But just consider your target audience. Are they going to be those who will read a third person blurb and go, oh, okay, I'm interested? Or will they go, oh, no, I want first person POV. I can't be bothered checking to see if it is. That's going to be a main thing in deciding what to choose.
And that's a great way to approach it too, I think. And then I think we'll get the readers in the right, like you said, the right mindset for when they do dive right into the book. So do you think, like, I know I have a terrible tendency to like overwrite my descriptions on just everything. Do you think for blurbs, less is more, or does it depend on the genre?
This is really interesting. Someone asked me on TikTok yesterday, like, what did they say? They were like, how much information should we put in a blurb? Like, how much is too much?
Right.
And I was like, that's like, how long is a piece of string? But also I have an answer. Like, it was just such a funny question, because part of me is just like, there's no way to answer that for absolutely every book.
Right.
But essentially you need to give readers just enough to make them interested. And you need to get rid of any details that are not absolutely essential to making them interested. Okay. So for example, I was critiquing a student's work the other day, and part of her blurb was that the main character's sister's life was hanging in the balance, blah, 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 blah. And we actually, by the time we went through and critiqued it, realized that it didn't matter that her sister's life was hanging in the balance. The important thing there was actually, I know it's like, and it's actually an important plot point, right? But it actually wasn't key to making the reader more interested in the story. What was more interesting was that the main character was then being asked to go away and do a thing. That could then affect, everyone she loves, kind of thing. By introducing the sister, we introduced a detail that readers have to process, and it wasn't enough to make them more interested. So we actually determined, even though it was an important plot point, it wasn't important in the blurb because it wasn't contributing to what was most interesting.
Right.
So it's a really funny, delicate balance. But if you keep at the forefront of your mind, like, is this crucial? Be ruthless, absolutely crucial to making the reader more interested in my story. Is this cutting to the most interesting parts of it? Where authors can trip up a bit is like, complex fantasy novels, for example. How do you describe the magic? Do you describe all the different types of magic, like the different types of, gifts people can get or what their magic can do? Generally speaking, no. It's like, it's really tempting to want to explain all that in detail, but that is a lot for a reader to process. And there are certain there are certain details that are easier or harder for a reader to grab onto. So one of them is names. This is not a massive issue in romance because normally you only got 2 names, which I like to keep it at no more than 2 names. 3 is like absolute max, but certainly in other genres it can be difficult to keep that down. And the other one is any of those real details, like places, types of magic if you're writing fantasy, relationships between family, like, you know, my cousins, brothers, sister, whatever, like all those kinds of things are actually not usually super important to a blurb. The reader will learn those things as they read the book. What they need to know is what situation your main character is in, how they got there, again, not in detail, but just the bare bones, how they ended up there, and what the obstacles are for them getting out of that situation. That's kind of all they really need to know. Your job then is to frame that in a way that is clearly understood and strip away any other details that add too much weight to the processing of it. Because if your blurb is not easy to read, they'll go read another one. There's no incentive for them to hang around because they're not invested yet. Another good thing to think about, and it is, I mean, you might have come across this, you've got a marketing background, but certainly in any kind of sales copy, you want every sentence to make the person need to read the next sentence.
Yes.
That's like, and the next sentence. And our goal is to get them to read all the way through the blurb so they can go all the way down to your call to action, which you should have at the bottom saying, you know, scroll up and click buy now, blah, blah, blah. Because then they're going to be that little bit more invested. You give them that nudge, they're more likely to buy.
Exactly. And I always think of blurbs, to me, as just in my head, I always think of it like a trailer for the book. Like you don't want to give too much away, but you want to give you want to give just enough, and the important, like you said, the important parts that'll really, you know, that they could expect to see as a big part in the book. Yeah.
And it can be difficult because, I mean, the other complaint that I was getting from authors was like, I feel like I'm too deep in my book. I can't step back and see it with an outside perspective. So I don't know what's important. So there's a really simple exercise that we do in Book Blurb Magic, which actually allows you to step outside, and it takes like 10 minutes. And by that point, you have sort of all your main plot points laid out, and you can really clearly see which ones you need to include in the blurb. Of course, then you need to kind of decide how you word them. But that is something that I definitely took into account when creating the course, because I don't have that problem when I'm writing your blurb for you. But I knew I really wanted to write a course that would help authors very specifically counter that problem and actually be able to step outside and see what is important. And it is really cool to see the blurbs that come back from my students. I'm like, yeah, you just got all of the important bits. And we can see that clear narrative flow. It makes more sense when you can kind of see it. So I literally, being a teacher, color-coded different sections of different blurbs and broke down what kinds of information they're including and where they're including it. And that's probably my favorite part of Book Blurb Magic, is there is a lesson in there where we go through like different best-selling blurbs, some that I've written, but some that like are just mainstream books that you will not heard of. And they're all color-coded and paragraph by paragraph. We're like, look, it's one sentence of this and one sentence of this and one sentence of this. And the really cool thing is most blurbs use pretty much exactly that formula. And like I obsessively read blurbs when I go to bookstores, trying to find ones that break out of the formula. But the really cool thing is if you follow that formula, it doesn't sound like you're following a formula, if that makes sense. You're not going to come out with a blurb that sounds like really cookie cutter, but you are going to hit all of those main points, and it will be a lot easier to see how much information you need to include.
And I love that. I love that method because it makes me think of kind of romance books. And I've mentioned this before on the podcast previously on previous episodes, that the romance book in itself, there is a formula to it, but everyone has different takes. Everyone has different notes and different things they add to it to spice it up and make it different. Same thing with the book blurbs, kind of the same idea. The format's similar, but it all is dependent on the writer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. Yes,
it does. And that's why I ended up getting interested in romance blurbs then, because they don't quite follow the same, like they do and don't follow the same formula. But in terms of, so a standard fiction blurb will be approximately like you've got your hook, let's say 1 or 2 sentences. One is best, but 2 is fine. And then 3 paragraphs, you set up building up the story and sort of tying it all together / raising the stakes and your call to action. Whereas I'm sure if you looked at a lot of romance blurbs, the first person ones, you'll get like 2 lines and then 1 line and then like 3 lines and then a standalone line. There's not this same sort of paragraph structure, which I found really interesting. I'm not entirely sure where that came from, but it's a very, I think of it as kind of, it's like a dramatic sort of poetry. It's almost like that kind
I
of. I
could see that. It's like a haiku or something, right?
Yeah, it kind of has that layout. And I think it's potentially what happens in those types of blurbs is that you actually kind of get multiple hooks throughout the blurb. So those standalone lines need to be things that like, because, you know, people skim, that's the other thing. So you need those standalone lines to kind of be things that are stand out about the story. Like, you know, she got scammed, or except that wasn't the man I was expecting, or, you know, those kinds of little moments in a blurb that stand out. I think it's really cool how first person blurbs actually split that up more. So a reader scanning through can just kind of instantly see those exciting points. And then the sort of, honestly, there's usually not a paragraph longer than 2 sentences, sometimes 3 in that style of blurb. And that's why I created the Spicy Blurb Playbook course, because I was like, okay, something really different is going on here. And I was getting, so I had lots of romance authors buy Book Blurb Magic, loved it, wrote their own blurbs, wrote their own first person blurbs, because I don't address first person blurbs specifically in Book Blurb Magic. It's all third person. But then they were asking me like questions like, oh, but you know, how much of this should I include? Or they were sort of just running into different problems basically. So then I was like, okay, I need to create an add-on course to this. So at the moment, I'll let your listeners know I sell the Spicy Blurb Playbook together with Book Blurb Magic. So they're like a bundle together. But essentially in Spicy Blurb Playbook, then I had to dip into like a whole new formula. So we still have kind of the basic structure of blurb, which is you need to set up who and where and what at the beginning. And then you need to usually introduce the second character. So usually the love interest, maybe how they met. And then you really need to kind of raise the stakes and show us what obstacles are in their way by the end of the blurb. So they still follow that basic flow, but writing it from first person comes with its own set of challenges. And also writing it in these like shorter paragraphs / single lines can be a bit of a different way to do things as well.
I like that you mentioned that kind of the romance is kind of driving some of these trends, right? Some of these different type of trends. And I'm curious to know, because I know romance is like one of the biggest genres out there currently. And I know that there are there's like, at least I think it's not all romance, but I know there's a big portion of it for self-published books. I think it's like 1 million a day or something. Yes, I know it's like huge. There is a huge segment of self-published romance books out there.
Isn't it like, I feel like it's 40% of all self-published books are romance. It's a big chunk.
Something like that. Yeah. I think I'm with you. I wanted to say 50, but I'm like, I'm not sure.
Every day, I'm sure.
Yeah, I know, right? You never know at this point. Might be more.
Yeah.
So I'm sure. Yeah. I feel like that's a big part of the driving factor, like you said, for kind of some of these trend changes, especially in blurbs. And I'm kind of curious, have you seen, or do you often see the dual POV? I've seen that a couple of times in several romance, like there's dual POVs. Okay. In blurbs.
Yeah. Let's talk about those. So that is something I cover in Spicy Blurb Playbook as well. Dual POV can be really good. So, okay, let me back up. You can write a single first person POV blurb for a book that's dual POV. I recommend going with the character who might be more relatable to your target audience. So if you've got a female main character, you've got a predominantly female audience, let's write it from the female perspective. And then what I would do at the end of that blurb is a little line that signals that it's actually a dual POV book, just to give readers a heads up. You know, often where people put like sometimes it's trigger warning, sometimes it's like this is a guaranteed HEA, you know, dual POV, blah, blah, blah at the bottom. That can be really helpful to signal. But the danger with dual POVs, they can work, but the danger with dual POVs is that a lot of them say the same thing twice. So when I was doing research for this course, I was like, okay, let's have a look at what they're doing. So for those who might not have written one before or seen one before, a dual POV blurb usually looks like you put the character one's name in bold, you've got half the blurb from their point of view, next character's name in bold, other half is from their point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's usually, male character, female character, but obviously there's all different combinations. The problem with this is that what I predominantly saw in my research is that female main character would say all these things about like how they met and, what kind of person he is and the obstacle that's in their way. And then we hear the exact same thing, but from the male character. And okay, maybe it's slightly different because it's from his perspective, but that's not building a narrative for our readers to follow. And quite frankly, you risk them getting bored halfway through and being like, oh, this is just the same thing. I don't need to bother reading the rest. They don't get to your call to action. They don't see, maybe you've got a note at the bottom that this is part of a series. They don't see any of that and away they go. So to write dual POV effectively, you need to choose different things for each character to talk about. Doesn't mean you can't have like some crossover, but you really want to make sure that you are adding to the story, not repeating yourself. And I would say that, if you think about your characters, they each had a different first impression of each other, but also, as in all relationships, like different moments are important in different ways to different people. Like, you've got some people who are like, oh, I remember our first date. And for other people, it's like, well, I actually remember 5 dates later, the first time you said this or whatever. Like everyone has their different moments that meant the most to them in a relationship. So it feels a bit artificial to have both characters talking about the same thing as though that's the biggest thing. So what I recommend is sitting down and thinking about what moment, what character traits, and what obstacles are most important or significant to character one, and then ditto for character two. Now, if there's some crossover, that's okay, but we want ideally some differences. Or maybe there's the same obstacle, but they feel differently about it. Maybe like family's an issue and one of them is like, screw family, and the other one's like, oh, actually, I really want to stay in with them. Or maybe it's like, oh, my family's going to cut me off, I lose money, and the other one's just worried about the emotional side of it. Like try to find the two sort of perspectives on those things. And then character one tells us maybe how they met, their first impression, their view of the obstacle. Character two then tells us about what is significant about that relationship to them. Maybe it's not when they met, or maybe it's like the way that they met rather than the thing that she said, like just something different to give us that really different perspective. And then their take on the obstacle, or their different obstacle, and then you close it all off. That is my biggest advice. I actually didn't see many dual POV blurbs that did that at all in my research. I'm sure there are some out there, but I was kind of just looking at like, the most popular ones on Amazon. And obviously these are books that have still done well, but what I wonder, because sometimes I sort of go on and see romance books and they have like almost zero blurb, like it's like 2 lines or just something really sloppy or something that just almost doesn't make sense. And yet they do still have, lots of reviews, presumably plenty of downloads. But I always think, my goodness, how much marketing has the author had to do behind the scenes to get all of that going? Like how much are they doing on social media to drive people to their Amazon to buy that, because their blurb's not doing the work for them? That's the beautiful thing about a great blurb, is that it's like your friendly little salesman on the side there who's like, hey, can I interest you in this? And they do that work for you instead of you having to hop onto TikTok for the millionth time and be like that exact same thing, right? It means that when readers get to your page, they have a reason to be interested in your book. You don't have to be there doing the hard work for them, kind of thing. So consider how much a blurb can actually take the load off for you in terms of that marketing as well.
Yeah. And that's why, like, I guess that's a big part of kind of why I kind of look at it through a market, or look at it as part of your marketing, because it is, it's part of that way to kind of pitch yourself, right? And pitch your book to your readers. Absolutely. And say like, look, here's the thing you didn't know you wanted. Right in front of you. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And more than that, also, it's like, this is the first encounter that most readers will have with your story. The first encounter they have with, I always thought it was slightly odd that it's like the first bit of reading a reader will do of your book. And it's something that you squish into the last minute, or like don't give much thought to. I'm like, this is literally the first thing they read. You labored over your first sentence of your first chapter, but they won't even get there if they don't read the blurb. So, I mean, I do know some readers who skip the blurb and go straight to the first chapter. Like, everyone's different. But I think, you know, blurbs are expensive for a reason. It's because they are important.
Well, and I've actually done that. I kind of ran my own experiment just for fun, just to see. And what I did is I actually, I listened to a lot of audiobooks. And so what I did is I just dove blindly into some romance audiobooks, knowing nothing about it, nothing about the author, nothing about the book itself, just kind of blindly did it. And I found some really great books in there. And then when I went back retroactively, after I'd already listened to it, to find out like the blurb, I know the blurb wouldn't have caught my interest.
Wow.
And that was,
see, that's,
and it was just, but I loved the book, and it was nothing to do like, and I'm sure, like you said, it was the author kind of just threw it. I felt like the author threw it together at the last minute. It felt like that because it felt very different from their own writing.
And you know what they probably did? They probably did. And I've spoken to so many authors who are like, I hate the blurb and I did it in like 5 minutes and it's awful. And also like, it's just, it makes you feel terrible. I think at the end of the writing experience, you should feel like, yes, I set my book out into the world with this awesome blurb. And it seems to be this horrible tripwire at the end of the process where people are like, oh, I've got to get my cover design done, which means my blurb needs to be done quick. I'll throw together this paragraph and just away we go kind of thing. And I think you know, authors know that they're selling themselves short, and it's like, it's depressing for them. We're kind of like, oh, I wanted to do so much better. But it is like, what I always say is like, it is a skill that you have to learn. You've written a whole entire book. Long form is your jam. Like I haven't written a full length novel. So like, I take my hat off to you if you've written a full length novel, or even like a novella. I haven't written a novella either. So like, that is something that I'm so in awe of. I'm like, you can sit there and write a whole book. The only reason you can't write a blurb is because you haven't been shown how. Like, how many books and courses have you taken about novel planning or like writing, or like, you know, there's just so much out there. And then if you Google blurb writing, usually it's like, keep it short. Make sure you mention, you know, these characters. Like, it's the blurb writing advice out there is generally very unhelpful. There are some good blurb writing books, I will say. There's a few more emerging on Amazon, which is great. But I chose to do a course because I wanted to show authors a bit more and make it more of a step-by-step process, but it's 100% something you can learn.
Well, and I love that you mentioned that too, because a lot of times too, and authors might be going off old information, because like you said, the blurb trends change, like and especially in the romance genre. So like what might have worked as a blurb like maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, may not quite work for the audience now. So what is one thing I am seeing change quite a bit, because it's kind of been in the discourse lately, specifically in the romance genre, is, you mentioned it, trigger warnings. So so thoughts, are you seeing that incorporated a little bit more now in the romance genre? I know I am. I'm seeing it a little bit more.
Definitely. And it's an interesting one, because I also feel like previously across all genres, trigger warnings were kind of just included on like the sort of the front matter of the book, almost like just that little, you know, paragraph, like, by the way, which I think authors and readers are maybe realizing is not always the best way to do it, because you could read the description. Like if we're buying on, say, Amazon, you read the description, you buy the book, you might not have looked inside it. And then you kind of, okay, maybe you got an inkling from the blurb that there were some things, but you don't know the extent of it. And then you buy the book and then you're like, oh, there's trigger warnings. I actually don't want to read that. So increasingly I'm seeing authors including trigger warnings at the bottom of the blurb. So I don't really consider that to be part of the blurb proper. Oh, okay. So in terms of like the word count, like I suggest 150 words, probably a top of 180 for romance. Like I'll write a blurb that's maybe 200 words long for an epic fantasy sometimes, because sometimes you need the extra word. That's definitely the upper limit. But for romance, you want to be sticking to like 150. I honestly keep most of my 150, 160. But I wouldn't include trigger warnings as part of that word count. That word count is purely for your hook and for telling your story and your call to action. And then at the bottom of that, usually we put a part in like, I don't know, sometimes we put it in italics or whatever so that it looks a little bit separate, and it'll have like title of the book is a, and then you might have some of the tropes, and then also trigger warnings for X, Y, and Z. So that's definitely something that I don't choose the trigger warnings, like the authors give them to me, and then I incorporate them at the bottom of the blurb. But that is 100% something like even 2 years ago, I don't remember putting trigger warnings at the bottom of any of the romance books that I was writing.
Right.
Writing blurbs for, rather.
Yeah. I've only seen it very recently in books that have come out probably in the last year is like where I've really seen it talked about and incorporated most, I think, within the romance genre. And so like I was I was starting to see that kind of pop up, but you're right. It's at the very end. It really wouldn't be part of the blurb proper. It would be at the very, very end of it.
Yeah.
And it's the tropes too. You mentioned tropes. Is that where you're kind of seeing that too? Cause hey, I love as a romance reader, I appreciate knowing my tropes going into it.
Yeah. And I think it also depends on the trope. Cause like, for example, Grumpy Sunshine is usually pretty obvious from the blurb, like, that's if you look at, the blurb for the love hypothesis, for example, or, any of those other ones that kind of, or the rom-com type things, like it's pretty obvious, grumpy dude, sunshiny woman, like that comes across. You can still state it explicitly at the end if you like, but those sorts of things come through. Same thing with enemies to lovers. That's a pretty obvious one that you kind of like, that would be obvious from the blurb too. Again, no problem with stating it at the end if you want to be, maybe somebody's like super lazy and they just skimmed through your whole blurb and didn't read it properly, and then they get to the bottom and go, oh, it's enemies to lovers. I love enemies to lovers. I'm going to get that. So it can always be worth putting that at the bottom. Where the main sort of things that I see at the bottom are things like guaranteed happily ever after, no cheating, standalone novel, people like to specify that as well, or whether it's part of a duet, so people know, like, or duet with cliffhanger ending, for example. So those are the things that I'm seeing the most down the bottom to signal to readers. The rest are a little bit more obviously in the blurb.
And one thing, and this is kind of a little off topic, but I forgot to ask you earlier. One of my friends actually did ask me. So when you mentioned about names, only adding 2, no more than 3, full names or just first?
Yeah, I tend to go with full names.
Okay.
It creates more relationship because like there's so many people called Bob, but if you have Bob Smith,
that's fair.
then that actually points out your character's individuality a little bit more, and they can feel more real. So my policy is to always include first names. Probably the only exception I've come across would be like fantasy, where you might get people who have a really complicated first name, for example, might be really long and a lot. And do we want 2 names? Not really. And if it's such an original name, you feel a connection with them already because you're kind of like, okay, and that's you. But when we're dealing with pretty much every other genre, I recommend putting the full name the first time you mention them, and then just first name or whatever afterwards. One thing to watch out for, actually, now I think about it, in romance blurbs is often characters go by a nickname. So I've seen authors put, I'm just trying to think of a name I can shorten now. Let me say, I don't know, like, if it's Margaret someone and then later on they call her Millie, that can be kind of confusing for a reader. So if your character consistently goes by a shortened version of their name, I mean, let's just go with Jess, for example, you could say they're Jess Smith rather than their full first name, if that makes sense. If that's how you want to refer to them throughout the blurb, I wouldn't be changing to their nickname halfway through the blurb, because the reader is going to go, well, did I miss something? Like, is this another person or not? And that's the last thing you want the reader to do. As soon as they stop, you want them to just keep flowing through to the end. They shouldn't have to. What will actually happen is they'll end up going back to the top of your blurb and going, what was the character's name again? And then you've kind of lost them. So and I don't think I've seen that in any other genre, really. It's mostly romance, because so often they'll go by a shortened version of their name, or just Yeah, I don't know why it's a romance thing. I'm just thinking about that
Oh,
now, but I've just seen it a lot.
There's a whole psychological thing. We've actually talked about this at our romance
Oh,
meetings. There's a whole psychological thing that they're seen as more masculine, especially men. You're going to see more men than women have a nickname. So like, and it's going to be usually like one, no more than 2 syllables. Like there's a whole psychology to it. I know I've looked into it.
I've noticed that, but actually the examples I was thinking of have been female names where they'll actually go by a shortened version of their female names. However, you're right. Like I'm thinking, I mean, Jax seems to be a really popular name as well. And that's obviously short for Jackson. So like it's, I've definitely seen that trend as well, but I've noticed that authors tend to just go straight to the shortened form for the men and not so much for the women. So that's just something to keep your eye out for. If your character goes by the shortened version for like most of the book, just introduce them that way as well. So it's less confusing. And the reason we keep it to 2 names, again, this is not a massive problem in romance generally, because usually there's only 2 people you're talking about. But when you introduce someone and it's their full name, that's technically 2 names for someone to process, first name, last name. So by introducing 2 names, 2 full names, you've kind of got 4 names, which is already quite a lot. You add a third one to that mix and it gets quite an overload. And it's just, there's something about names that is just harder for a reader to process. That's where people get confused. Even like books that introduce a whole lot of characters, people kind of often whinge a little bit and they're like, I've lost track of the characters already. So even when you're in a book, introducing lots of names is tricky. So in a blurb, in 150 words, you really want to keep things as simple as possible. Usually a third name in a romance blurb is like an older brother or something like that, in which case you can just use their first name. You're not going to introduce your older brother with first and last name. If they're related, just go with the first name. That's totally fine.
Okay. Yeah. And that sounds really fair. Yeah. Cause if there are too many names thrown at me in a blurb, I just get confused and I'm just like, what is happening?
Yeah. And it's also a good idea to try and space them out as well. Like you're going to, have one in the first paragraph and then, one in the second paragraph kind of thing.
Yeah.
If you introduce them both in the first, it can get a lot. If you're writing a first person blurb, that cuts down a name for you because you're generally not introducing the name of, no one says, hi, my name is blah in a first person blurb. So we end up actually not knowing that main character's name, which I've sort of thought about. And I think in a way that's kind of weird, but a lot of romance readers read for like this immersive feeling. So in another sense, it can actually make the reader more immersed in your story because they take on that like they become that person. So I think that's possibly a reason first person blurbs have become so popular in romance. The other one is just that potentially it's come from a lot of self-publishing authors who just prefer writing in first and just did the same for their blurb. So then what would happen is that really you might end up with only one name in your blurb because then they say, then I saw Benjamin Gold, and like that's it.
Yeah.
That's the only name that you get in your whole blurb. So that is an advantage of first person for sure, that it cuts down on a little bit of that name fatigue for you.
And that's a smart way too, to kind of, like you said, kind of cut down on those names and kind of use it strategically, right? To kind of like capture the reader. Speaking of strategy, as a marketer, I had to ask, because this is something actually I've talked about with other book marketers as well. They said sometimes if you want to kind of get a little more traction on your books, sometimes look at the 2 first things you should always look at are your cover and your blurb, because those 100%. Those are the easiest things to change and or kind of fix in case you're not getting like traction around your book that might help you.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. Yeah. I actually had a romance student who had done Book Blurb Magic, and then she sent me a message a while after she'd done it. She was like, okay, I changed my cover and I changed my blurb using Book Blurb Magic. And she sent me a screenshot of her KDP and she was like, look what happened. And she was getting sort of moderate sales, and she literally tripled her sales like a day later. And it was consistent for like, it lasted. I mean, she'd given me like a week's worth of screenshot. Interestingly, we noted that no one really bought on Monday. So we were like, is it No Smut Monday? Is that a thing? No one's got time to buy a smut on a Monday. But the rest of the week was literally triple sales.
Wow.
I think she may have tweaked some of her Amazon keywords as well, but she said predominantly the main things she changed were cover and reworked the blurb.
Mm-hmm.
And I had seen her blurb previous and the blurb that she wrote in my course, and it was an insane improvement. Like, it was, the previous blurb really didn't do it justice at all. So it 100% has quite an impact on sales. Obviously, like, I can't promise you're going to get triple sales just because you change your blurb and your cover. But it was really cool of her to send that through, because, you know, we know that these things make a difference, but it's really cool to sort of see it working for people as well.
Yeah. And I can absolutely agree with you on that, because as a marketer, that's something I've seen, I've seen consistently throughout, working with other authors in my job. I've seen a lot of times they will tweak their, like you said, tweak their keywords, or they will improve their blurb. And a lot of times that gets them more traction on their books, gets them into the algorithm a little bit better, because of the search terms, and because people, people are looking for those things, and they readers end up reading them. And like you said, like a little salesman, just be like, hey, buy me. And they're like, okay, done.
Exactly. And we know that Amazon, when you search, like, we have our keywords that we put into Amazon, but we also know that Amazon search also searches the blurbs as well. So the more, like, I don't necessarily advise sitting down with a list of keywords and being like, I need to cram all of these into my blurb. Because you can get a bunch of them into your little thing at the bottom saying this is an enemies to lovers, blah, blah, blah at the bottom. But B, because you want the language to sound natural to people who are looking for books like yours, because that's also going to be part of possibly how they search, phrases that they put in, for example. But we do know that is absolutely an important part of searchability. I'm really curious though, like, as a book marketer, like, have you ever like looked at blurbs and been like, whoa, that's a massive turnoff, like that needs to change?
Well, that was, like I mentioned, it was that one that was first person and then it was third person when I read it. That kind of threw me off.
Yeah.
But, and like I said, there's been a couple where they didn't grab my attention. I think you're right. It just had repetitive information, or it called out, like I said, to me, it's like a trailer in word form in a way, and it calls attention to specific things that may not be very important in the book, or they just kind of fall to the wayside. Like there's like a couple throwaway sentences about this one thing, and it's supposed to be, but because it was called out in the blurb, I thought it was a bigger piece of the story than it really was.
Well, and this is it. The other thing is that if you let a less important information, a piece of information, fit into the blurb, readers are going to expect it to be important, and then they might get to your book and be like, where's the bit about, oh, was that it? So again, it comes back to this accuracy thing. Like, does it accurately capture all of those main important things? Are readers going to read it and be like, oh, this really satisfies the curiosity that I had about that particular point in the blurb? I will say though, like you said, it didn't grab your attention. The hook is so important, and it is something that authors really struggle with. So I, like Book Blurb Magic, I have hook formulas that you can actually pretty much fill in the blanks, not perfectly, but they do help authors a lot. And again, they don't sound formulaic once you do them, because everyone's different. But then I also put a whole bunch of different hook formulas into Spicy Blurb Playbook specifically for romance, because there's several options, and if you have a kind of few frameworks, it helps to fit in. But as we said earlier, a question is a really good way to start a blurb, because it's really hard to walk away from a question. It's really hard to read a question and not be interested. Make sure it's not a rhetorical question. It's not my point with those ones. But a question that, could genuinely make people think. Generally something maybe like that mafia one, a little bit uncomfortable, like, whoa, what happened there? Right. Or something a little bit deeper, thought-provoking, or just like a surprising situation, trying to play off that. You can also use like I don't really have a good name for this, but it's kind of like when you have a statement and then a almost opposing statement, kind of like an either-or situation. So, I thought I didn't want this, so why do I, really want so-and-so? That kind of thing is quite common in a hook. So, I never fall for the bad boys, so why am I falling for blah? That kind of structure is quite common for romance hooks. And that the more surprising you can make the paradox, like the one I gave just then, it wasn't my best work, but I'm thinking on the fly here. But the more interesting you can make the paradox, the more surprising the more the reader's going to go, whoa, what's happening here? Like, that's a massive contradiction. Or like, how did you end up in that situation? Or why have you got that choice? So I do think that's quite a powerful structure to use as well, particularly for romance.
I love that too, because you can almost like call out types of tropes without calling it out, right?
That's
like
very true. Yes.
Yeah. Like an opposites attract, or like you said, grumpy sunshine, something like that. Like I know she's, she's from a very rich, prestige family, and I'm a biker with a bad past or something like that, totally opposites. But that would definitely grab my attention of just like, I am intrigued.
Exactly. And intrigue is what you want, because if they're not intrigued, you might have written the best opening paragraph for your blurb, but no one will ever read it if your hook isn't interesting enough.
No.
Similarly, another thing to watch out there is make sure that your opening paragraph makes sense even without the hook. Occasionally people write a hook that is almost just kind of part of the blurb. Like, it is really intriguing, but then it continues on in paragraph 1. It's killing me that I can't think of the example now. I wasn't going to talk about this, but it just came up. And what can happen occasionally, and I don't know if it's like the blurb writer in me. I'm like, I don't need to read the hook. Like, I want to get to the meat of the blurb. So I will sometimes actually skip a hook. I don't know if that's really weird. But you should always have a hook. But occasionally I've skipped the hook and then they're like, this makes no sense. What? And then I have to go back up and read the hook, and then the whole reading experience is just kind of ruined. So the other thing is, don't assume that readers are going to read your hook first and then your blurb. They're probably going to, but in my mind, they should always work quite separately. The hook is like the surprise thing, and people are like, what? And then you get into the blurb proper, and later on in the blurb, it'll expand a bit on what was in the hook. Not like a chronological thing.
Okay.
Because your hook is your most, exciting thing. Does the most exciting thing happen at the beginning of a story? No. Otherwise, no one would read your whole book. So that needs to go up the top. But then the start of your blurb is going to be setting up the character and the setting, etc. So we're not going to get to, further details about that hook until a little bit later in the blurb as the stakes are being raised.
No, I love that. Because that would hold my interest. I'm right. And that's what you're looking for. You want to hold the reader's interest to where they're like, all right, now I want to buy this book, or I want to get this book because I need to know more. So, and that's the whole point.
They might be reading your blurb going, I want to find out, like, tell me more about that hook. Do you know what I mean? So then you lead them down through the blurb to find that information. It is a bit of a sort of, I think that's another thing that can be tricky about approaching blurbs, is that as authors, you've written a book that is designed to be read in chronological order. But a book blurb needs to have your book blurb is not written in the same beginning, middle, and end that your book has, because that doesn't work for blurbs. You need to put something exciting up the top. Then you have like a little bit of your setup. Then you're going to dive into probably like the middle, but then you can't give away spoilers. So it's not like you can write the end of your book. You actually have to come back to what the main crux of your story is and explain those obstacles. So it's not the same as you're not telling the same story of your book as you are in the blurb in that sense.
I mean, all this is amazing information. So much packed in those little sentences, like a handful of sentences, right?
I'm glad. I could go on for hours. Rest assured, or if you want more of these sentences, they're all packed into Book Blurb Magic and the Spicy Blurb Playbook. If your listeners are interested in just Book Blurb Magic, they can go to bookblurbmagic.com, and that's where you can buy the course. If you're interested in Spicy Blurb Playbook, if you head to spicyblurbplaybook.com, you'll get access to the free mini course, and then you'll have the opportunity to buy the bundle, which includes Book Blurb Magic and the Spicy Blurb Playbook. I am planning on doing an update of Spicy Blurb Playbook in the next month, and I'm going to stop selling the bundle because Spicy Blurb Playbook is going to be expanded into its own standalone course, because at the moment you need to do some of the fundamentals in Book Blurb Magic before applying the Spicy Blurb Playbook principles. So if you buy within the next month, you will get the bundle. It's awesome value, and you can get 10% off with our discount code, which is Romance the Story. So if you pop that in, you'll get 10% off. But after a month, I'll be doing the update. If you're already in, you'll get to keep Book Blurb Magic and you'll get access to the new Spicy Blurb Playbook. So this next month is the time to buy if you want everything. you can also grab, I have another freebie just for, I know you said you have some other genres of authors who listen in. Mm-hmm. So if romance is not your thing, but you're interested in blurb writing, head over to my Instagram. I've got a little freebie there for fiction and nonfiction writers as well. So just at Book Blurb Magic, same on TikTok. Or you can email me, jessie@bookblurbmagic.com, and just ask me if you've got any questions about any of the services. And if you've listened to this and gone, oh my goodness, I don't want to write my own blurb, this is too much, I do also write them. So, and you can find all of that info on my Instagram again as well, or just email me. I think I covered all of the links there.
Thanks so much to Jessie for all the incredible information in writing blurbs. I know I'll definitely be using all of it to help craft my book blurb in the future. And we may have to do a part 2 because there was just so much information we could have unpacked. If you'd like to follow Jessie and hear more about the hot topic of book blurbing, I have linked her socials in the show notes at Book Blurb Magic. Guys, if I'm being really honest with you, I have been smashing my goals this year to be more active on the podcast, and I plan on bringing a lot more awesome interviews. The easiest way to keep up with my hectic schedule and on who might be appearing on the next episode of the podcast is by following me on my socials at Romance the Story. That's where I post the interview schedules and any additional content first. I got some really exciting things I'll be announcing soon, so definitely keep your ears and eyes peeled. I also now have a Buy Me a Coffee if you're interested in supporting the show in that way. You can find me under Romance the Story. As always, be safe, stay well, and keep writing. Bye!